Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 11 of my Witchwood card review. 5 new cards this time around, including a card that people are calling the worst card of the set so far. I don't know if I agree, so we're going to have to talk about that. If you don't have a lot of time, though, you can use the link in the description, skip to my quick reviews at the end. On the other hand, if you've got a little while, you want to hear my in-depth thoughts on these cards, let's go ahead and jump into my detailed reviews. So up first here, this is Duskfallen Aviana. And yes, I have seen a lot of people calling this the worst card in the Witchwood so far. People seem to really hate this one. And I don't know if I think it's the worst card so far. I admittedly think it's pretty bad. It has a lot of problems to overcome, but I do see the slightest chance, just the smallest hint that this card could possibly be played. So let's talk about it. Duskfallen Aviana here, clearly a spin on the Aviana of old. This is one that has been corrupted. We've seen that before, taking a previous card, putting a new spin on it, giving it some kind of crazy adjective at the beginning, and yay, we've got a new card based on an old character. So Duskfallen Aviana, as opposed to standard Aviana, is a 5 mana 3/7. And her text reads, the first card each player plays each turn costs 0. So here's the use case, right? You slam Duskfallen Aviana on the board, you spend 5 mana. Perhaps you do some other things. Those other things are not discounted because Duskfallen Aviana was the first card you played, so it doesn't work where the next card you played. That's not how it works. So you play other things, maybe if you have any mana left at their full mana cost, then you hit the end turn button. And now, because Aviana is on the board and it's your opponent's turn, they get to play their first card for 0 mana. So let's say they have, for instance, a Blood Reaver Gul'dan that they couldn't play yet because it's only turn 5, but you played Aviana. So now they slam their Blood Reaver Gul'dan and they get that hero power. Maybe they already had a couple demons in the pool. And boom, they have an insane turn because guess what? They still have 5 mana left. And then they can very easily just deal with your Duskfallen Aviana in a handful of different ways, probably. Maybe they already had the Siphon Soul, it's turn 6. Maybe if not, they do some other Warlocky thing to kill it. Maybe it's a Zoo deck and they slam a couple Soul Fires. Well, maybe they just trade a couple minions in, right? And then suddenly your Aviana's dead. Goes back to you, and you don't get the discount. You never got to take advantage of Aviana's discount because your opponent got to utilize it first, and you basically gave them all the time and all the tempo in the world to remove your really big threat, your awesome card, your setup. And that basically explains why Aviana is so problematic. You create this symmetrical effect that's really powerful, but then you give it to your opponent first, so they get to utilize that effect long before you do, and they probably get to deny you the same effect, because if they have all that extra mana, all those extra cards to work with, then boom, your Aviana dies. And that feels like a really bad play. And that's why I think, somewhat rightfully, everybody's saying this is one of the worst cards we've seen so far, maybe even the very worst card we've seen so far. It's really hard to make her work, and it can backfire in some major ways. It's sort of like that Temperist style play where you give your opponent all the initiative, but by the time it comes back to you, they've probably already won the game or done some crazy thing or denied you any sort of value. And it's very unlikely that you get to take advantage of that power play when it comes back to you. So, yes, at a base level, fundamentally speaking, Duskfallen Aviana is pretty darn bad. But I don't think this is the worst card, and I don't think this is a 1-star card either. Because I do think there are some ways to use this. First and foremost, some decks, if you're even on the board, won't necessarily be able to kill Duskfallen Aviana even with a discounted card. Some people just might not have the answer. You can see that sometimes you play something like Lyra. There are those occasional instances where you slam a Lyra and it just lives. Now, clearly, this is a little different because you're giving them extra resources, but if the deck doesn't run hard removal or any sort of damage, and they didn't have minions on the board, the best they might be able to do if they're a minion-based deck is just play a bunch of minions. Think about, for instance, like a Spiteful Summoner Priest. If you played this into a Spiteful Summoner Priest, yeah, they could play a couple Spiteful Summoners maybe, but they probably wouldn't be able to kill your Duskfallen Aviana that exact turn. Now, a lot of decks will, so it's never going to be like a totally safe meta kind of play, but it could theoretically stick every once in a while. And if it does stick every once in a while and your deck is utilized to take advantage of it, then the very next turn you can do something like play a 0-mana Malygos, play a swipe and a couple Moonfires and win the game. Or you could even do something like, if you have 10 mana, you could drop like an Ixalan Fungal Lord, drop a Malygos, an Ixalan Fungal Lord, and a Faceless Manipulator, and boom, you have 3 Malygos on the board with a couple Moonfires in hand. Boom, your opponent is dead. So there are ways to use this, right? There are some crazy plays you could do if it sticks. But again, really big challenge. Most meta decks will have a way to answer this immediately. But another possible use case for Duskfallen Aviana is something like Carnivorous Cube, for instance. If you drop Duskfallen Aviana on turn 10, or at 10 mana with Carnivorous Cube, and you sort of bank your Avianas inside that cube, your opponent might have a much harder time dealing with the cube because they're not getting the free mana. The Aviana is not on board, so they're not going to have the extra mana to deal with it. If they don't have exactly that silence or an ability to trade into the cube and then clear the board, if you're running Naturalize or if you can trade into something with your cube the following turn, you might be able to get 2 Avianas back out. Now, granted, again, you wouldn't be able to use them in the same turn, but that just increases the likelihood that they stick, that they hang around, that you can still get the value. So there are ways to sort of hide or bank your Aviana value. Still some problems. Still really bad. I think the card is awful. I'm not I'm not saying it's good or that it's going to define the meta or that it's going to be in a tier 1 deck. Don't say those things. I'm not saying that. This is a bad card. I'm just trying to come to its defense a little bit and explore opportunities for it. People say I'm always too negative. Well, this is one time I'm trying to be a little bit optimistic about Duskfallen Aviana. I don't think it'll work, but hey, there is just the slightest, tiniest, just sliver of hope that this card sees play. So now let's move on to the next card here. We have a hunter card called Wing Blast. This is a new 4-mana spell. And people are, I guess, so far saying this is maybe the best card of the expansion so far, which is kind of remarkable as well. This thing's getting near 5-star ratings across the board from what I've seen so far on Hearthstone top decks where people rate the card. A lot of great feedback on this one already. Basically the exact opposite of Duskfallen Aviana. And I guess I'm going to turn a little bit the other direction. I think Wing Blast is really good, once again, but I don't actually think this is a 5-star card. I don't think this is as perfect as people are saying. I think there are a couple issues with this one. But first, let's talk about what it is. Wing Blast, 4-mana spell. It deals 4 damage to a minion at its base level. And if a minion died this turn, if something already died, then you get to cast Wing Blast for 1 mana. So let's go ahead and talk about the ideal state. Let's talk about a 1-mana deal 4 damage spell. Obviously, that's solid. It's pretty good. Other, deal 4 damage to a minion cards would cost 2, 3, 4 mana, depending on what else they do. For instance, if you look at things like Stormcrack, that's 2 mana, but also, of course, has the Overload. If you look at something from the past like Flame Cannon, that was 2 mana, but it was a random target. So obviously, a 1-mana deal 4 is much better than those other things. A more recent example you could compare it to as well is the Jasper Spellstone from Druid, which starts out as a 1-mana deal 2 and can grow from that to 1-mana deal 4 and 1-mana deal 6. And that is certainly a playable card in Druid. It does get played. But I will say that even with Lesser Jasper Spellstone, usually it's not that awesome at 4 damage. In my experience, it's certainly the most powerful at 6, obviously. But in some cases, you don't even feel like playing it at 4. Like, it's just not quite worth it. You want to hold it for that 6 to make sure it kills something really big and is substantial, particularly because 5 health is such a big threshold in Hearthstone, and so many things hit that 5 health mark, but not the 4 health mark. Now, the 6 is probably not that common, but just over 4 is the important part. 5 instead of 4. And that's when Lesser Jasper Spellstone gets really good. Other times, you kind of have to use it in a pinch to kill 2 health stuff, and that's solid, just killing those Knife Jugglers from time to time. And Wing Blast could still be that. It could still be that in a pinch, kill a Knife Juggler sort of card, and that would be fine. That's solid. That's really good. Like I said, I think this is a good card. I just don't think it's the best card ever, like some people are saying it is, or at least the best card in Witchwood so far. Because, again, the max efficiency, the max value out of this is that 4 health mark, and it's just not quite as common or important as other health thresholds. Beyond that, another challenge here, of course, is the condition. So I'm saying that this is a pretty good card, solid card, even great card when it's 1 mana, but of course it's not always 1 mana. There is a condition to be met here, and I think people so far are overlooking that aspect a little bit. I don't think it's quite as easy to kill a minion as often as you want it to be, because the kinds of scenarios and plays in which you're going to want to use a Wing Blast is probably when you're a little bit behind on the board, or your opponent has initiative and has a minion or 2 ahead of you. Even if you have the ability to play a minion and catch up, it might not be that easy to kill something, because you might be playing a minion that turn and using your spare mana for the Wing Blast if you had spare mana. This basically means you kind of had to have initiative and keep a minion on board, or alternatively use some other sort of spell or setup or weapon to kill a minion at the same turn. So yes, this combos pretty nicely with something like Eaglehorn Bow, for instance. You can drop the Eaglehorn, trade into something, and use Wing Blast. But I think it's going to be more often than people expect where you're not really able to kill something, where you just didn't have the setup, and this is sitting in your hand as a 4 mana spell. Now, there will be instances where a 4 mana deal 4 is still okay. That might be a desperation play. You didn't have anything else to do anyway, so hey, slam your Wing Blast, and you got out okay. You accomplished something with your turn. That's fine. But I would say like 30% of the time, that's just a completely made up number, but you get the idea. Not a majority of the time, but a portion of the time, this is just not going to be a 1 mana spell. It's going to be that 4 mana spell instead. And you're going to have to wait to use it. And then the mana might not line up as well. There might not be as good of a target, or it wasn't as strong of a tempo play as you thought it was going to be. So essentially, the best kind of deck to use a card like Wing Blast would be one that could get onto the board and keep initiative. So a deck that plays a 1-drop, plays a 2-drop, plays things on curve, so you're always ahead and you always have a minion to trade in. But unfortunately, I think Hunter decks that are built that way are going to be more focused on face damage. They're going to be more aggressive decks. They're going to be looking to kill their opponent at some point. And Wing Blast only marginally supports that playstyle. Yes, killing minions can support a more aggressive playstyle, of course, because you're protecting your own assets, denying your opponent the opportunity to trade, but you also sacrifice some flexibility, because this just can't go face. It can't be that finishing blow, so sometimes it might be a dead card. If you have the board, you're looking to pressure, looking to pile on, and this just doesn't contribute to that game plan. So, I guess, again, I'm not totally knocking the card. I think it's good. I think it will be played. It probably isn't as amazing as everybody's hyping it up to be at this point, I guess. I don't want to be a downer. I was trying to be optimistic with the last card, maybe a little pessimistic this time around. But it's going to be a little bit more awkward to use this than people are giving it credit for, and I'm still not totally confident that it's going to work super well in a Hunter just because of the archetype concerns. So clearly a slower, more control-oriented Hunter deck probably likes this sort of higher tempo removal spell, because it helps them do more in a single turn if they're behind, and that's good. But again, I think they have a little bit harder time activating the condition if they're behind, so that's a little challenge there too. And I guess I should note, I mean, we did some comparisons here to previous cards, like I think I mentioned Stormcrack and Flame Cannon. Another example is Arcane Blast. That was sometimes a 1 mana deal 4 damage spell on a condition, because you had to have spell damage to make it deal 4. So I guess that's kind of similar in some ways to Wing Blast, and clearly Arcane Blast was really solid. When you could get that 4 damage, it seemed really important. But I will say that that was played primarily in Tempo Mage, a deck that was able to utilize their spells for additional aggression with things like Flame Waker, or at a reduced cost even further with things like Sorcerer's Apprentice. And I don't know how Hunter is going to be able to do that. How are you going to use Wing Blast to apply additional pressure or increase the efficiency beyond just itself? Because Arcane Blast alone wasn't necessarily worth it. It was when it was combined with all those other high synergy options in an aggressive deck that supported it that made sense. So occasionally getting that 2 damage ping from Flame Waker made your Arcane Blast really powerful. I don't know that Wing Blast has that deck or has that setup to push it to the next level that makes it just an absolutely amazing card instead of just a good card. Okay, so I obviously said a lot there about Wing Blast. I'll try to keep it a little bit more concise here with the next Hunter card. This is Rat Trap, a new secret, and it reads, after your opponent plays 3 cards in a turn, summon a 6/6 rat. And that's a crazy big rat, first off, but also a crazy big minion for 2 mana. A 6/6 for 2 is awesome. That's fantastic. And if you compare this to something like Cat Trick, for instance, a 2 mana secret that summons a 4/2, or you could compare it to like Wandering Monster or Bear Trap, which basically on average get you about a 3/3. Clearly, this one has a lot more upside. But, of course, I think Rat Trap's a lot easier to play around for your opponent. There's just going to be a lot of turns where they never even dreamed of playing 3 cards anyway. So I guess this is kind of the highest reward secret, but also the riskiest. So the risk-reward equation has to be figured out here for any given deck to see if it's worth it or not. Because Cat Trick, pretty much always going off. Wandering Monster, if they want to win the game, is 97% of the time going off. Rat Trap is not going to have to go off all the time. They can maybe get by with only playing a couple cards. That said, I think it's still really good. Some decks in particular do want to play 3 cards in a turn. Obviously, you could use really big examples like Miracle Rogue, who plays 47 cards in a turn. But even just looking at an aggro deck, something like, Paladin right now, which plays a lot of fast cards, there are many instances where they could play 3 Murlocs in a turn, or a couple Righteous Protectors in any other random 2-drop, or just whatever other card, especially late in the game. So those sorts of decks, in a lot of ways, will activate Rat Trap. Maybe not right away. It might take more towards the mid-game where they've got a little more mana to work with. Instead of 2 or 3 mana, it's more like 5 or 6 or 7 mana, where they start to get into that 3-card per turn trap. And then they have a real risk, a real concern. But I think the more important aspect here of Rat Trap is not necessarily that it will go off, but that your opponent knows it might go off. And that means that they can't play 3 cards in a turn because they're just too scared of the 6/6, because it might be too many stats for them to deal with, or it might give you that lethal push if you're an aggressive hunter. It's just such a big swing that they can't risk it. And then that means they start to make non-optimized plays. They start to do things they don't want to do for the risk of Rat Trap, or they start shifting their mana around and make worse plays just because they know that Rat Trap exists. So I like how much friction this card introduces, even if it's something that they don't have to worry about. Now, I guess against most control decks, they can probably get by with playing 1 or 2 cards per turn, but there are even still control decks that like to play multiple things. You think about Priest, they have cheap cards like Northshire Cleric and Power Word Shield, and Warrior has all those little cheap Whirlwind and removal cards, that this card could still cause problems for those sorts of decks as well, where they can't set up the multi-card combos or the big plays that they're trying to do because Rat Trap is there to deny them. So I kind of like Rat Trap. I think it's cool. Against aggressive decks, it can punish them for being aggressive. Against control decks, it can just create that additional friction that sometimes makes them make a bad play or a less than perfect play. And then sometimes you're going to get a 6/6, which is a really big hunter minion that can hit face a lot and take some good trades. So to me, there's a lot of upside with this card. And, if we're already playing secret-based decks with cards like Lesser Emerald Spellstone, you gotta have secrets. Cat Trick's rotating out, so Rat Trap could be the perfect card to slide in and replace it that does a somewhat similar thing in that it summons a minion on some condition. So maybe not quite as consistent or good as Cat Trick, but nonetheless a card that I could see finding some play in Hunter. So now let's talk about Holy Water, a new priest spell. This one comes in at 5 mana, reads deal 4 damage to a minion. If that kills it, add a copy of it to your hand. And I'm just going to come out with it. I really don't like this card very well. I've seen some fairly positive responses to it, but as soon as I compare this card to something like Entomb, for instance, it just starts to fall really far short. And there are a couple reasons for that. And before you get started, yes, I know there's a big distinction here in that Holy Water adds the card to your hand, whereas Entomb adds it to your deck. And certainly adding something to your hand can be an upside because you can utilize it immediately. It's there as an option. But frankly, in a control-based priest deck, adding something to your deck can be an upside as well because it adds an additional card and puts you 1 turn farther from fatigue. So if you're playing in a really control-based deck, I'm not sure that adding it to your hand is actually all that much better, particularly with priests who can often have really full hands, as I've experienced lately. So let's call that a wash for now, but on top of that, or beyond that, when you compare Holy Water to Entomb, it's so much worse. Entomb always works, doesn't have to have any sort of condition of killing the minion, and secondly, it removes it from play completely. So things like Death Rattle effects, for instance, are irrelevant. When you entomb a Tyrian Forge Ring, you just put it into your deck. When you Holy Water a Tyrian Forge Ring, yes, it comes into your hand, but your opponent also gets the Ashbringer weapon to utilize, and that's the case for any other Death Rattle minion you consider. So Entomb has that silence built in that Holy Water does not. Beyond that, the other big challenge for a card like Holy Water is that 4 damage, again, just isn't that much in Hearthstone. There are so many things that don't die to 4 damage. So this card requires like an additional instance of damage to get the stuff you want, because you want like really cool, awesome, high-value minions. And most of those don't have 4 or less health. So maybe you have to trade in some other stuff in the first place to set up your Holy Water. You might have to combo it with like a Duskbreaker, for instance, and perhaps that's fine, but other times it might be pretty inefficient because you didn't want to use your Duskbreaker yet on a single threat. So a challenging condition to satisfy. The result to me can be good. Of course, you know, generating a minion out of thin air is solid in a deck that's looking to go long, but you often won't have the mana left to play that immediately, so it's going to have to be a future resource of some sort. So when you combine the difficult to achieve condition, the fairly high cost of this card for dealing 4 damage, which is the only instant part of its effect, the fact that you probably have to utilize other stuff with it, which is challenging sometimes because it just won't line up. All of that means that this is a really slow card that's probably going to be stuck in your hand pretty often too. The instances where this lines up perfectly are just going to seem really rare. And if you compare this to something like Bane of Doom, for instance, yes, Bane of Doom's damage is lower, but you also get that instant impact of that minion being summoned onto the board, so it's a much swingier card. The same can be said for something like Firelands Portal. Like, you get the minion instantly, and yes, those are both random minions, and yes, Firelands Portal costs a little more, but each of those have their own distinct advantages. Demons being high synergy sort of things with Bane of Doom. Firelands Portal being able to go face. And to me, that just leaves Holy Water in this really awkward spot where it just seems it's going to be impossible to use. I just don't think this card ever lines up. It's fine to exist off something like Lyra or card generation cards. Yeah, it'll be played here and there, and sometimes it'll be fine. But to actually make room for this in your deck, there are so many competing cards, so many great options for Priest. I don't see how Holy Water ever makes the cut. So now let's talk about what I think might actually be the worst card of the set so far. This is Witch's Cauldron, a new neutral minion, a 3-mana 0/4. That's a big problem. That reads, after a friendly minion dies, add a random shaman spell to your hand. Well, that's a problem too. So Witch's Cauldron is essentially like Cult Master, right? Cult Master, classic card we have. 4-mana 4/2, whenever a friendly minion dies, draw a card. But instead of drawing a card from your deck, which you put in your deck and you know is good and you know synergizes with your plan, instead of that, you get a random shaman spell, like Totemic Might, and a lot of other really situational, hard-to-use shaman spells. And that's where Witch's Cauldron falls apart. It's a significantly worse version of Cult Master, because first off, the effect is worse and the stats are miserable. It cannot attack, so it just sits out there and it dies for free. Even if you do generate a couple cards out of it, which is certainly possible in a shaman deck where you run a lot of token stuff, the fact that it just sits there and it doesn't do anything makes it worse than like Manatide Totem or Cult Master, both. And of course, Cult Master doesn't really see much play anyway. It has in the past from time to time, but there are better card draw engines out there than Cult Master, and there will be way better card generation engines than Witch's Cauldron. Now, Blizzard has teased that they're adding really powerful new shaman spells, but they're still going to be, 1 or 2 spells in a pool of 25 or 30 pretty average spells. So in total, you might have like, a 5 or 10% chance to get something really good, and your opportunity cost there is enormous because you're playing a bad card, you're putting a lot of risk and inconsistency into your deck for a very minimal upside when you could just run a good card instead, or a card that draws you something you want. Now, I guess there's some weird world where shaman spells in particular being offered to other classes creates some opportunity, but that still seems problematic more than helpful because, again, you just get those Totemic Mites and all these decks that can't run totems outside of the occasional Nightmare Amalgam, I guess. So just some fundamental issues here. Really problematic that it doesn't have attack. If it was like a 2/4, hey, maybe I could see a shot at this. But since it just dies for free, the spells it gives you are unlikely to be relevant. Even in Shaman, I doubt they're super worth it. I don't think Shaman would find room for this. I think they'd probably just rather run Manatide Totem for all those totem synergies. So to me, a card that just looks miserable on every front. I just don't know if you can play 0 attack minions in Hearthstone these days that don't do something really specific that you need them to do, like Doomsayer or Manatide Totem or Flame Tongue Totem, which is Cauldron, just because of that inconsistency. The challenge of, frankly, getting it to work anywhere where you trade minions in successfully, and that's still a good play for Shaman, and that's a pretty rare case too. The same problem that faces Cult Master essentially. All of that means this one's just not going to work. Okay, so those are the detailed reviews for part 11. Maybe the best and worst cards in Witchwood yet. I'm not quite so sure myself, but hey, the community thinks so, and you guys are pretty smart, so maybe I'm wrong. But for now, what I'd like to do is go ahead and jump into my quick reviews. Duskfallen Aviana is a 2-star card. Wing Blast is a 4-star card. Rat Trap is a 4-star card. Holy Water is a 2-star card. Witch's Cauldron is a 1-star card. And there you go, that wraps it up. Part 11 is done. 5 new cards, new legendary, some crazy stuff, some bad cards, I think a couple solid ones as well. So a nice little mix there. But I'm curious what you guys have to say. Do you think Wing Blast is the best card so far? Is Aviana the worst card so far? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what I got wrong, what I got right. I love to hear your take. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.